Okay, so 1968, Rout of the Liberals, Part 2. This will provide a somewhat truncated discussion of the Chicago, or the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. There are so many details, it is impossible to get to all of them. I will provide some generalities. I will also say that one of the best books on this is David Farber, Chicago 68. Farber is a historian of the 1960s, definitely has his pulse on much of what went on. I've read a handful of his books. Excellent historian. He is now at at Kansas University. So let's get to the convention. August 26th, Richard Daley would open the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Now, who's Daley? Richard Daley, of course, the mayor of Chicago, which was considered kind of the last of the great political machines in the country. His son would become mayor after him. And, of course, what do we know about Chicago politics? Corrupt, inbred, and Daley very much represented this. But if we look at the convention as a whole, Daley is the perfect symbol of the convention. He was violent, he was crazy, and he was in charge. He had 12,000 police officers, 5,000 National Guard members, and 6,000 federal troops on standby for the convention. Now, delegates who entered the convention were asked for their credentials repeatedly. So you'd have somebody come in the morning, maybe exit for a while, come back in the afternoon, would still be bullied and asked for these credentials. Security would police the aisle of the convention nonstop. They harassed anti-war delegations. A convention delegate from New York and candidate for Congress was refused entrance to one session until he surrendered his copy of the New York Times. Alan Rosenberg, who was the leader of Manhattan's largest Democratic Reform Club, was dragged from the aisles when he protested an order to quit conversing. CBS reporter Mike Wallace, who many of you may still be familiar with, was covering the arrest of Rosenberg. He would get punched in the face by a cop. That was actually caught on video. So many basic rights are pretty much suspended in Chicago. Daley, again, he was in charge. He was a Democrat. He was not going to let anybody challenge him. Nobody was going to usurp his authority, and nobody was going to publicize or make popular any anti-war demonstrations or any of that stuff. Again, Daley very much in charge. And from the 27th through the 28th, we see riots outside the convention. And these included the Yippies and MOB, which we'll get to here in a little bit. Now, MOB, M-O-B-E, was a coalition of anti-war groups. They chose Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis to lead the contingent at Chicago. But there was internal dissent among MOB. Some favored violence. Some favored civil disobedience. There is not complete agreement. They would eventually settle on civil disobedience, and we see many protests. Of course, the civil disobedience did not always remain civil, and it was often not the fault of the protesters. Daley, for his part, refused to provide permits to either group to demonstrate, but both the Yippies and MOB would agree to, or did decide to continue their protests regardless. Now, one significant factor, these groups had made their decisions to go to Chicago and cause chaos prior to Johnson's announcement that he would not seek re-election. Once he announced he would not run, some of the air came out of each movement with regard to taking these actions. But again, they show up, they protest even though Daley has refused their permits. As the time approached, those in charge expected tens or possibly even hundreds of thousands of protesters. This was something that had been publicized all year. I talked about the Yippies in my previous video lecture on 1968. MOB, again, the same thing. This was a connected group. They had many. I mean, think about Hayden and Davis as their leaders. These are two of the more important figures from the 1960s. They had publicized this. They had asked for people to turn out. When Hayden would finally arrive on August 24th, he declared, "My God, there's nobody here." There were only 5 to 10,000 demonstrators that would show up for the Battle of Chicago. Again, this was quite a bit lower than what they had anticipated and certainly what they had hoped for. Now, the convention itself was held in the Chicago Amphitheater. It was surrounded by 7 feet of barbed wire fence to protect those in attendance, and I guess prevent any protesters from getting in. Bulletproof panels were protecting the entrance. 1,500 police officers were in the immediate vicinity on the ground, in helicopters, and on rooftops with their rifles, ready to shoot if anybody got out of control. Inside the convention, there was great turmoil. As I mentioned, a New York representative was attacked. Mike Wallace was clobbered. And "dump the hump" became the major slogan. Now, let's go back to the Democrats during this time. Eugene McCarthy challenges Johnson, does much better in the New Hampshire primary than people thought. Bobby Kennedy enters the race. Then Johnson leaves the race. Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. Gene McCarthy is left as the main anti-war candidate. But who was the vice president for LBJ? Hubert Humphrey. Now, this is the same Hubert Humphrey that gave his amazing speech in 1948 at what would become known as the Dixiecrat Convention, the Democratic National Convention 20 years prior, when he led Democrats to recognize that civil rights should be a primary part of their party platform. So Humphrey has had substantial success at previous conventions. This one, not so much. Again, for many, they believe "dump the hump" is the way to go. In other words, apologize. In other words, get rid of Humphrey. Dump the hump. Many on the left wanted nothing to do with him. He was close to LBJ as any of the candidates. Again, he was vice president beginning in 64. He was a bit confrontational regarding Vietnam early on, but when he spoke out against it, Johnson shut him out of his inner circle. Like literally would not allow him into major discussions, would not go out in public with him, would not communicate with him. Eventually, Humphrey would capitulate so that he could, again, be part of the administration. But this shows the pull that Johnson had during the time. Now, Johnson never provided public or even private support for Humphrey. One reporter asked Johnson his thoughts about Humphrey. Johnson's reply, "He cries too much." The reporter pressed him for clarification. Johnson repeated, "That's it, he cries too much." Ah, masculinity. There are calls for Ted Kennedy to run. He was 36, definitely would have been in over his head. And even when he would run for president in 1980, when he was asked by a reporter, "Why do you want to be president?" he just froze. He felt that it was his responsibility as a Kennedy to continue the legacy. He was in no way prepared for that. Of course, we know what happened in Chappaquiddick. Somebody's family could not be contacted for comment. Anyway, so we see, again, division within the Democrat Party. Many do not want Humphrey. Humphrey is really the best choice left. We talked about McCarthy, some of his issues. On Wednesday, in the convention, issues over Vietnam would finally come to a boil. A proposed platform debate was made regarding Vietnam. Many in the party had agreed to an unconditional end of bombing to get Hanoi to the bargaining table and expedite the end of the war. Johnson did not agree and would not agree. Thus, Humphrey, knowing he needed Johnson's support, even if it was minimal, he did not agree. Chaos would ensue on the floor. One priest knelt on the floor, prayed for peace. McCarthy delegates put on black armbands and chanted, "Stop the war, stop the war." Peace delegates from New York sang chorus after chorus of "We shall overcome." But again, it led to nothing. And Vietnam was very much, if you can believe it, among the officials, Johnson, Humphrey, etc., very much minimized. Now we go back to the beginning of the convention on Sunday night before it all begins, because I'm kind of focused a little bit here mostly on what happens inside the convention. Now we're going to talk about what happens outside the convention. Violence would hit Lincoln Park. The Yippies were told to leave because of the curfew. And of course, they did not have the permit they needed. Many, though, well, some people do take off. They go back to their rooms, their homes, whatever, but many would stay. Those who stayed would end up being clubbed by the police. Additionally, there were reporters from Newsweek, Life, and the AP who were there to cover their demonstration. They also would be clubbed by police. The battle would continue the next 2 nights, which we'll get to some of these specifics. And I will share some video links on YouTube so that you can see the disturbing nature of what was happening in the streets right outside the Democratic National Convention. Now, on Wednesday night, the action would move from Lincoln Park to Grant Park. 10,000 were supposed to march to the amphitheater under the leadership of Moab, and they held a rally in Grant Park. The meeting was legal and orderly until one protester climbed a pole to lower the American flag. Police would then drag him away. The police would be bombarded by eggs, concrete, and balloons filled with paint and urine. In retaliation, the cops regrouped and charged into the peaceful mass of the crowd, flailing away. Groups still waiting permit to march were denied. Police enter the fray to break up the line of the march. Demonstrators look for a way to get out, but they are literally trapped by the police at the intersection of Michigan and Balboa. 4,500 yippies, Moab radicals, and McCarthy supporters were crowded together, trying to find a way to escape. Literally trying to find a way to escape the police who were bearing down on them quickly. The route to the amphitheater was blocked by them. The route north on Michigan was blocked, and another group of police was moving down Balboa with their clubs at the ready. TV lights illuminated the area even though it was dusk, and people started chanting, "The whole world is watching. The whole world is watching." Police, for their part, would remove their badges and charge. A few reasons for this. One would be so that they could not be recognized if anybody filed formal complaints later. Another reason was this: they believed, okay, well, we'll take our badges off, then we're on equal footing. It's not, if you attack me, you won't be attacking a police officer. Of course, these are peace activists. They are assembling in Chicago to demonstrate. They are physically attacked by the police. And the police, for their part, again, are swinging at anybody close. They're swinging at protesters. They're swinging at bystanders. They're swinging at medics, people who are there to provide medical attention. And indeed, not only are they swinging at them, they're hitting them all. When a cameramen caught the attack until they too would be billy clubbed by police. One person who watched as all this went down was Norman Mailer, a rather famous American writer. He would write this, quote, "The police attacked like a scythe through the grass, lines of 20 and 30 policemen striking out in an arc, their clubs beating demonstrators fleeing. Seen from overhead from the 19th floor, it was like wind blowing dust or the edge of waves riding foam onto the shore." Now, while this is going on, when we get to the inside the convention, delegates are bored. They're listening to speeches about mundane topics. Again, they are Vietnam is minimized. They are unaware of the carnage by the Hilton until finally filmed reports would flash on TV monitors around the hall at around 9:30 that night. Peace delegates shouted for adjournment, and pandemonium hit. The crescendo of the inside the convention, of what would happen inside the convention on this night, focuses on two primary actors: the brave Abraham Ribicoff, a senator from Connecticut, and the mayor Richard Daley. Now, it's going to be some naughty language here, so this is fair warning. After everybody realizes what's going on, Ribicoff stared down at Mayor Daley, who was less than 20 feet away. He said, "With George McGovern, we wouldn't have Gestapo tactics on the street of Chicago." The Illinois delegation leaps up, they boo, they wave clenched fists at Ribicoff. Daley would point at Ribicoff, and when you see the video, you can see his lips. If you can read lips, you can read he's saying, after Ribicoff says this, Daley looks at him and shouts, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch." Ribicoff looked at him, shook his head, replied, "How hard it is to accept the truth. How hard it is." Imagine, again, the bravery of Ribicoff saying that in Chicago, right by Daley, so far away from his constituency. He mentioned George McGovern. McCarthy, again, has lost a lot of his oomph. Nobody's really excited about Humphrey. George McGovern is a potential candidate. His name is floated. That's why Ribicoff brings it up. Of course, McGovern will run again in 1972 against Nixon directly, and he got destroyed in that election. Of course, Watergate was partially about spying to gain an advantage in that election. Nixon didn't need to do anything against McGovern to earn that victory. McGovern was not a great candidate, but that's a moot point at this point. Later in the evening, after all this happens, the police would raid McCarthy's headquarters at the Hilton and beat up his young workers. Now, the police again take action against many demonstrators. We see this physical violence, and we see, I mean, really, the conflict is a 4-night event. It starts on Sunday and it really reaches its crescendo on Wednesday. They beat many people unconscious. At least 100 demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators, had to go to emergency rooms. Over 175 were arrested. Daley afterwards would say the confrontation was not caused by the police. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder. What? Again, that is a quote from Daley. The policeman isn't there to create disorder. The policeman is there to preserve disorder. 28 years later, notably, we get to 1996. The Democrats would hold their convention in Chicago again. Some of the same police officers were on the force. Underneath their uniform shirts, they wore T-shirts that said, quote, "We kicked their fathers' butts in '68, now it's your turn." Oh, by the way, Hubert Humphrey was nominated as the Democratic candidate for president. Some of the blowback on this: in March of 1969, the government would indict what was initially called the Chicago Eight for conspiracy to cross state lines with intent to incite a riot. They were found guilty of 175 counts of contempt of court. And what's notable about this, I said the Chicago Eight, this would actually change when Bobby Seale, as I mentioned before, the leader of the Black Panther Party, refused to quiet down in the courtroom. He would be bound and gagged, removed from the courtroom, and he would have to face the court separately. Now, I wanted to provide a couple quotes here because when we get to the Chicago Seven, and make no mistake, the trial of the Chicago Seven was a complete circus. But these seven were found guilty of 175 counts of contempt of court and intent to riot, but no one served any time because of a successful appeal. Now, among these groups, David Dellinger of Moab, Davis and Hayden, who I had mentioned earlier, Hoffman and Rubin from the Yippies, Bobby Seale, and a couple of others. One of the things, this is just kind of an interesting quote, I think, from the case. Defendant Abby Hoffman was asked whether he had entered into any agreement with the other defendants for the purpose of promoting violence. Hoffman's response: agreement? We couldn't agree on lunch. And indeed, I've talked about this. There's great division within the left at this time. Violence, nonviolence. How do we approach this? Do we go to Chicago and protest even though Johnson's not running anymore? Who do we support for president, et cetera, et cetera? There's no division. And so this quote from Hoffman, I think, says a lot. We couldn't agree on lunch. Yet here they are being accused of intending riot and inciting riot, more importantly. More blowback. Amazingly, American people generally agreed with how Daley had dealt with the rioters. A national poll found 71% of the public regarded the city's security measures as justified, while 57% held that the police and National Guard had not used excessive force. Now, when you watch the video, or maybe you've already seen video of this, you can ask yourself, did they use excessive force? I'm not a police officer. I've never been in that situation. It seems, though, that other options could have been taken. And make no mistake, this is fomented by Daley, his attitude, his views on protesters in general. And the police are following orders. There is, in one of the videos, you'll see an image of a police officer standing alone smoking a cigarette with concern on his face. And you almost wonder, is he questioning, was this the right thing to do? Now, what does this say about the national mood in August of '68? It says plenty. Again, when you get to the youth, they're upset, they're not happy, they're willing to protest. But when you get to more middle class Americans, and again, this is the Democrat Party, and that's the Liberal Party in 1968. Make no mistake. But even their supporters believe that Daley took the right action. This tells you that many are exhausted with change. Many people are sick of, again, rich students complaining, rich white people complaining about this or that, demanding things. They're sick of, college kids taking over buildings. They're sick of violent reaction. They're sick of the rioting. So when they see the images of these youths in the streets protesting, they see that as unnecessary. And again, this helps to somehow justify the treatment of the police. So again, this tells you a lot about the national mood at this time. It tells you part of the reason why Nixon would be elected. Again, there are a lot of people who are tired of all the activism, all the complaining, etc., that we see in the 1960s. And this will continue into 1970. And really, even though I wouldn't call Nixon the diehard conservative many believe he was, we see kind of a veer toward conservatism with Nixon. Even in 1976 with Jimmy Carter and his election, he was a Democrat, but not a hardcore liberal, much more moderate, if you will. And then, of course, we see Ronald Reagan for 2 terms. Another question you might ask when you watch all this and think about everything that happened at the convention: how does the Democratic Party survive this? Think about all the internal division. Think about the violence. Think about Democrats attacking Democrats. It's still the party will survive. And even though the electoral vote, of course, was a smash for Nixon, what if Wallace doesn't run? What if it's just Humphrey and Nixon? Is Humphrey able to garner not just those electoral votes of Wallace's, but the other popular votes, which would then lead to more electoral votes? Something to consider. I think many would look at Wallace as taking away votes from Nixon, which I think is probably a little bit more legitimate, but one wonders how the Democratic Party survived and how things could have been different. That's 1968.